A golden corridor flickers with torchlight. Yet in its silence a maid kneels, trembling hands sliding a tray of bread and cheese before the prince's door. She is a shadow in a palace of marble, while he, heir to the throne, sleeps behind walls guarded by arrogant courtiers who sneer at hunger and call cruelty discipline. Each night, she risks discovery, her eyes hollow with fear, her sacrifice unseen by the world that grinds her kind beneath polished boots. And when the prince finally uncovers the reason for her secret offerings, what he finds will shatter everything he thought he knew. Before we begin this beautiful period romance story, tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I love knowing where you're joining me from. Night settled heavily upon Madrid, the kind of silence that clung to the palace after the last echo of music and laughter faded from its gilded halls. The lamps along the great gallery glowed with faint, steady flames, while in the kitchens far below, servants scurried to extinguish the hearths. The royal household obeyed an invisible rhythm. The nobles retreated to their chambers, the guards began their patrols, and the servants who kept the vast machine alive moved like shadows in the dark. Among them was a figure smaller and quicker than the rest, her face half hidden beneath a kerchief. She had worked all day, kneading dough, fetching water, cleaning vessels that shone with stubborn grease. Yet as others drifted toward the sleeping quarters, she lingered. Her hands, still reddened by scrubbing, lifted a small wooden tray already prepared in secret. A loaf of bread, a wedge of cheese, a slice of roasted fowl saved from the evening's abundance. She paused, listening for footsteps. Then she began to climb. The service staircases wound narrow and steep, lit only by the occasional torch. Her shoes scarcely made a sound on the stone. Up she went, past storerooms, past the chapel door, past the hall where noble portraits stared down with cold authority. Her breath quickened, though not from the climb. This part of her journey never failed to stir fear, because where she was going, she did not belong. The corridors near the royal apartments were not meant for servants at night. The floors gleamed, the silence pressed down like judgment. She moved cautiously, keeping to the wall, clutching the tray close to her chest. At the last corner she stopped. The door she sought stood ahead, tall and dark, marked with a crest no servant dared to touch. The chamber of the prince. She lowered the tray carefully to the floor, every motion deliberate. The bread shifted, the cheese rolled slightly. She steadied them with trembling fingers. Then she straightened, gave a single glance to the closed door, and stepped back into the shadows. She did not knock. She never knocked. Her task complete, she vanished as silently as she had come, leaving behind her secret offering. The next morning, the prince noticed the tray. He had woken early before his valet arrived, a habit born of restlessness more than discipline. Pale light crept through the tall windows, throwing long shapes across the polished floor. And there it was, set neatly outside his door, untouched, as though some invisible hand had placed it in the night. At first, he thought nothing of it. Perhaps his valet had left it, or perhaps it was a forgotten gesture from the kitchens. But when the same sight greeted him again the next dawn, and again the day after that, suspicion began to stir. His life was measured, constrained by the demands of rank. Every meal, every hour, every word spoken to him was accounted for. Yet here was something outside the order of court, a mystery slipping past layers of watchful eyes. He did not like mysteries. "Did you leave this?" he asked his valet one morning, his voice sharp. The older man bowed, confused. "No, Your Highness. I prepared your breakfast as always. I would not presume to place food at your door without command." The prince studied the tray. The bread was fresh, not stale. The cheese cut cleanly, not hastily stolen. This was no accident. Whoever left it did so with intention, and that intention was not yet clear. The thought lingered with him through the day. At the council chamber, as ministers droned of taxes and conscriptions, His mind wandered to the quiet hallway outside his door. At supper with his mother, when she admonished him to sit straighter, to speak with authority, he found his gaze drawn to the servants bearing platters of game and fruit, wondering if one of them carried a secret. That night, he resolved to see for himself. The palace by night was a world apart from the bustle of day. Torches hissed along the corridors, and the guards' boots struck the marble with a steady rhythm. Within his chamber, the prince dismissed his valet early. He did not undress fully, but sat in the dim glow of a single candle, listening. His heart thudded with a restless beat, though he told himself it was mere curiosity, not unease. The hours stretched. From somewhere far below came the muffled clatter of pots being stacked, the laughter of servants finishing their labors. Then silence. Only the ticking of the clock on his mantle measured the passage of time. Midnight. A sound, the faintest scuff of shoes against stone. The prince rose noiselessly, moving to the door. He let his hand rest on the latch, waiting. The footsteps grew nearer, slow and cautious. Then a soft creak, the hinges of the outer door shifting as if touched by a careful hand. Through the narrow crack, he saw the shadow of a figure bending down. A tray came into view, lowered gently to the floor. In that moment, something tightened in his chest. It was not fear, nor anger, but a strange tension, as though the air itself had grown charged. He threw the door wide. The maid froze. Her eyes widened in shock, her face pale against the torchlight. The tray wobbled in her hands before she set it down quickly, as though completing the task might erase her trespass. For a heartbeat she seemed unable to breathe, unable even to move. The prince stood framed in the doorway, tall and severe in his nightcoat, his gaze fixed on her. Between them, on the floor, lay the tray, and neither spoke. The maid stands frozen at the prince's feet, the tray between them, with no possibility of escape. She did not run. Running would echo through the corridor and bring footsteps she could not withstand. She lowered her eyes to the polished floor, to the small tray between them, and gripped the edge to keep her hands from shaking. The silence wrote itself into her bones. "Forgive me," she whispered, and the words seemed too loud for such a narrow passage. "I meant no offense." The prince did not move. He stood like a question she could not answer. Candlelight from within his chamber spilled across the threshold and touched the hem of her skirt. She could feel the warmth of it on her ankles, ridiculous and human, in the middle of a danger that could undo her entire life. "Who sent you?" His voice was low, controlled. "No one." The truth was a blade. She dared to hold it with bare fingers. "It is my own doing." "Why here?" His eyes did not leave her face. "Why night after night?" She swallowed. If she spoke more than necessary, she would say too much. If she said nothing, she would betray herself with silence. "Because it must be night," she said, "and because day is crowded with eyes." A breath, his, not hers, shifted in the doorway. "And what do you expect to gain by this?" "Nothing," she said, and for a moment the answer steadied her. Nothing at all. He considered her. She could not see judgment in his expression, only calculation, and that might be worse. His hand was still on the door, and she sensed that if he closed it quickly, a shout would follow and guards would come, and there would be no breath left to plead. Her palms grew damp on the wood of the tray. "You will return to the kitchens," he said at last, voice measured, as if testing how far control could carry him. "You will do precisely what you are assigned, and you will not come to this door again." The words struck like cold water. "Yes, Your Highness." She reached for the tray. He did not step back. He stood where he was and let her lift it from the floor, the bread and cheese at eye level for a brief, ridiculous moment. She did not dare look up. The scent of the candle, of beeswax and smoke, laced with the faintest hint of citrus from his chamber, something clean and unreachable, stung her senses. "Go," he said. She bowed, precise to the inch, and withdrew without turning her back upon him, the way one might leave an altar. At the end of the corridor, she took the corner quickly and vanished into a darkness she knew better than daylight. Her heart hammered a path down stair after stair, through a door that always stuck, along a passage where damp climbed the walls, past a kitchen silent under banked embers. Only when the noise of her own blood dimmed could she breathe. Behind the soot-dulled hearth, a scrap of cloth jerked with her exhale. She took the tray into a shadowed niche and pressed her forehead to the cool stone. Tonight had been too close. She had stood within a breath of the prince and lived. The thought made her knees weak. She hid the food where she always hid it when she could not complete her path. It would not last by morning, not in a place where hunger never slept, but she could not carry it back the way she came. Not tonight. She rinsed her hands quickly, as if washing away the touch of risk, and slipped into the narrow bed among the other servants, careful not to wake anyone. Eyes open in the dark, she counted each inhale to keep fear from becoming panic. Dawn would demand hands and feet and work, as if this night were nothing but an extra beat in the palace's heart. She would make it seem like nothing. That was the only way forward. When sleep finally took her, it was brief and full of doors. The morning woke the palace with a precision that felt like a command. Bells in the chapel shook faintly through the walls. Footsteps multiplied. Voices arranged themselves into duty. In the prince's chamber, lamps were extinguished and curtains drawn back to let pale winter light cross the rugs. He rose earlier than usual. Habit and restlessness dragged him out of bed before his valet could pull the bell. The corridor outside his door looked as it always did, polished, stern, echoing. No stray tray waited to provoke him, only a narrow slice of shadow where the sill met the floor. Something in him missed it. The thought surprised him. When the valet came, he dismissed questions with a wave. He took his breakfast by the window, looking down at the formal gardens where hedges obeyed the geometry invented by a mind that disliked surprises. He liked order. He was trained to. The court liked him most when he was the sum of his discipline, clear in speech, precise in bearing, exact in courtesy. The night had unsettled that balance. A maid, unknown, had stood at his door and offered him a mystery dressed as bread and cheese. He should have sent for the steward. He should have set the machine of the household to work and let it locate the small stone that threatened to jam the wheel. Instead, he held the matter close the way a man might hold a letter whose seal he could break or keep unbroken. When he left his chamber, he did so without hurry. He moved along the corridor as he always did, acknowledging bows and curtsies with a nod that never lingered. But his gaze, for once, dipped from gilded frames and marble busts to the movements of those whose entire purpose was to remain unseen. He saw her. At first it was only the tilt of a head, the way a cloth moved against the curve of a forearm. In a crowded landing where linens were being carried past like small white clouds, she was a different kind of stillness, the kind that was alert. He did not slow, because slowing would read as interest, and interest created rumors. He simply let the angle of his body change as if the wall required it, and took note. Later, at the arch leading to the service corridor near the chapel door, he passed again as she slipped through with a bucket, eyes down. The scent of boiled starch rose in the air. She kept to the narrow areas that did not belong to his world, but the palace was one organism, and its pathways crossed often enough to make invisibility difficult. If he watched with intention, he could map her. And so he watched. It was a strange task. He did it between meetings, between the measured steps of a walk with an older noble who desired favor and did not say so. He did it with the exactness of a man who had learned to distrust his own instincts and therefore used method to substitute for feeling. She did not look for him. Not once did her gaze rise as far as his face. She moved quickly, cleanly, without waste. It should have ended there. A prince had better matters to attend to. Yet the question persisted, a small thread that would not break no matter how he tried to fray it. By midday, his mind had settled on a decision it did not admit to anyone. He would follow her path when the palace slept again. If he at least knew why, he told himself, he could act. Mercy and justice required facts. That was what he told himself when the truth was that his curiosity had the weight of something more personal. He had gone to sleep for years behind a door guarded by protocol. To think that someone had stood outside it nightly, risking, what? Punishment? Shame? Pain? He did not know. But the risk had been real. He had seen it in the way her breath stopped when he opened the door. And she had said she wanted nothing. That answer irritated him more than any lie could have. The day exhausted itself as days at court do, through repetition, ceremony, and the constant correction of the self with small, invisible gestures. He spoke where he must, nodded where he should, kept silence where it was wise. When the sun slid toward the horizon, the palace altered its shape again. Torches rang to life. A yawn of servants and soldiers opened into evening. He dismissed his valet early for the second time in 2 nights. He changed into darker clothes. The reflection in the mirror looked the same jaw, the same tired eyes, the same attention to order. Only the intention behind them had shifted. He moved along back corridors instead of the grand hall. He knew them. A palace is an education for those born into it. He reached the staircase that cut from the kitchens up to the floors above. The air grew warmer, richer with the scent of broth and herbs, and the sound of pots being set to dry beat a small rhythm against the stone. He stayed where light did not fall, and waited. Time in such spaces stretches. He measured it again by breaths, by the scrape of an iron lid, by the once-repeated drop of a ladle into water. At last she appeared. She had the tray. It was the same neat arrangement, the same care in how she shifted weight so the bread did not slide. He watched her check the corners, as if the palace could sprout eyes from the dark. Her shoulders squared, and then she began to climb. He followed at a distance, leaving a wider gap when the passage narrowed. He knew exactly how far away a footfall must be to become only a whisper. She took the first turn toward the royal floor, and then, without warning, she veered left, not toward his corridor, toward a wing that had fallen out of use when a suite had been remodeled, and no one with rank had found a reason to return to it. It was not a grand place. A tapestry hung crookedly over a section of wall where plaster had cracked years ago. The smell here was different too, less wax, more dust. He slowed as she did. She paused before the tapestry. She listened. It was not the listening of someone who feared being discovered alone. It was the listening of someone who feared for what she guarded. Then she lifted the lower edge of the tapestry, reached behind, and was gone. The prince stood still. A fiber brushed his knuckles where his hand had grazed the wall and left a thin smear of blue dye. He stepped closer, but he did not disturb anything. The sound he heard in the small seconds that followed was not footsteps, not speech. It was the muted clink of wood against stone, the soft thud of a tray being set down on something unseen. Moments later, she emerged. Her hands were empty. Her face was heavy in a new way. Not the fear he had witnessed last night, but a weight that comes when a burden does not get lighter with habit. She glanced to the right and left, lowered the tapestry, and drew her breath in as if sealing a chest. He did not move until she had gone. He did not follow her beyond that point. He did not call to her across the dim hall. He stood there with his back against the cold, rough wall and understood that he had been wrong about the nature of the mystery. It was not about him. It was about something hidden where the palace's attention could not find it. He felt both relief and something darker, a displacement he did not have words for. He could have left it then. He could have told himself that the girl's secret was a small thing, not a threat to the realm, and therefore beneath his concern. But the location burned in his thoughts, a space inside the wall itself, a space no one had authorized, an absence that only a desperate person would fill. He returned to his chamber late and let the candle burn longer than it should. Sleep hovered at a distance and refused to settle. He replayed the angle of her shoulders before the tapestry lifted, the way her fingers curled inward a moment after she left whatever was behind that cloth. He found the movement again and again, the private habit of someone who had been carrying a fear and had not yet found a way to put it down. When he finally slept, it was with the decision made. He would go back. He would not drag servants, nor send orders, nor raise an alarm that would turn compassion into dust. He would go himself. The next night dressed itself in the same carefully layered silence. He made sure the corridor to his own suite looked undisturbed. He walked the longer way around, through a colonnade that the daytime courtiers favored, and the night ignored. By the time he reached the forgotten hallway, even the echo of the kitchen had fallen to a hush. He found a place in the shadow opposite the tapestry, a small niche where the wall had once held a bracket for a lamp and now held only darkness. He pressed his shoulder there and waited. His mouth was dry. He told himself it was the air. He told himself many reasonable lies and arranged them neatly. She came when the palace's clock sighed the hour. Her steps were soft but sure. The tray was less full than the first 2 nights he had seen it, a practical adjustment to the difficulty of carrying and concealment. He could measure the urgency in such small changes now. She paused again. She listened again. She lifted the tapestry again. In one movement she slipped inside. He followed. He had calculated the space behind the hanging would be narrow, little more than a maintenance gap or an abandoned passage. He had not expected the feel of it to be so immediate. The wall embraced the shoulders. The air smelled of plaster and something stale, a life held back from sunlight for too long. The light was the thin kind that bounces from a carried candle and has no source within itself. He kept a pace that made him disappear into the rhythm of her actions. She did not sense him, or perhaps she sensed everything and had decided the risk lay in what lay ahead, not behind. The space opened into a small chamber no larger than a storage cupboard. The stones there had bled heat all day and now released it in a slow, tired way. He could make out a shape on the floor, a pallet or blankets rolled and unrolled. He could see a cup on a crate. He could see the shadow of the tray in her hands lifting from shape to shape like a word whispered across a sleeping face. She crouched. She set the bread down with care, and the cheese, and a small paper-wrapped parcel she had slipped beneath the loaf to hide it. Her hands moved with a tenderness that did not belong to routine. The prince stopped just inside the opening. He stood in a sliver between the wall and the scene, and let his breath obey the space's need for quiet. He heard it then. Not her breath, not his. A third pattern of air, the slow pull and release of someone trying to sleep through hunger or pain or fear. It was too steady to be an animal, too human to be anything but what it was. It carried the kind of restraint that people learn when sound can bring danger. It shifted, and the blankets made a sound like paper being folded. The maid reached out and placed her palm on the lump of fabric from which the sound came. "Eat when you can," she said softly. Slowly. "There is time tonight." The prince felt the heat in his face change direction, as if shame had its own temperature. He had followed to find a crime or a folly. He had found intention that his world would name a crime, and his heart could not. She rose. She turned. Her eyes met his not because she was looking for him, but because he occupied the doorway she had to pass through to leave. In that instant the space shrank, and the knowledge that someone else breathed within it drew tight around all 3 of them like a cinched rope. He put a finger to his lips. She did not scream. For a heartbeat her body readied itself to fly backward into the chamber and put herself between him and what lay inside. He saw the small calculation in her pupils. He saw the separate pull of a different impulse. To plead. "Do you see?" she whispered. It was not a question and not an explanation. It was an acknowledgement that he had eyes, and that something within him might have been changed by using them. The shape in the blankets stirred again, weakly. A hand, a single hand, reached for the cup on the crate and missed it by an inch. Everything in the prince stiffened with the neat habit of rescue. He took one step forward and then stopped, because if he crossed into the light, her secret would be no longer a secret even to himself. He would have to name it in words that turned mercy into rebellion. He stood instead and let his throat work once, twice, and found no words that would not do harm. "Tomorrow," he said. "I will be here tomorrow." Her breath caught, not with relief, with a fear that had learned to distrust hope. He stepped back into the narrow hall, giving her room to leave, and held the tapestry aside. She slipped through, small and swift, and together they lowered the fabric until it lay as it had before, an ordinary curtain over an ordinary wall in an ignored part of a palace that imagined itself entirely known. They did not speak again. They would not agree on what had happened if they tried to define it. The prince pressed his palm flat against the stone after she had gone, feeling the faint radiance that meant a life was breathing on the other side. It warmed the center of his hand. He could not undo what he had witnessed. He could only imagine what would follow if he failed to control who else might witness it. The palace learned secrets the way a forest learns fire, fast, through small, dry connections. One careless word, one curious glance, one slight misplacement of a tray, and the whole scaffolding of silence would burn. He drew a breath that felt like a decision. In the darkness behind the tapestry, a small sound came again, then steadied, the quiet rhythm of another's survival drawing its line through the night. The prince discovers that the maid is secretly feeding a hidden figure within the walls of the palace. He did not return to his chamber at once. He stood with his palm pressed to the stone until the warmth faded from his skin and the line of his breath found its old rhythm. The corridor beyond the tapestry remained quiet, an ordinary stretch of wall claiming nothing. In his chest, something argued for the clear road. Wake the guard, order a search, call it loyalty. Another voice, older and lonelier, said that sometimes duty begins with silence. He chose silence. On the walk back to his rooms, he rehearsed sentences he would never say in a council chamber, words that admitted fear without shame. Words that allowed tenderness to exist inside a palace that prized restraint. By the time his hand closed around his own door, those sentences had already been sealed away. What remained was a single promise he had given without thinking. Tomorrow. Inside, the chamber's air felt thinner. He dismissed the valet with a nod he had practiced since boyhood, let the candle burn lower, and stood by the window. The gardens below were a geometry of sleep. He could not convince his thoughts to align themselves so neatly. He saw again the failed reach of a hand toward a cup. He saw the maid's palm settle over a mound of blankets, as if her touch could quiet the world. He had not asked who it was. He had not needed to yet. The truth had the shape of a human body and the weight of a risk that would crush her if released in the wrong direction. He slept only when the candle gave up. Dreams came as a procession of doors that would not open or would not close. Dawn arrived with bells that felt sharper than usual. The valet's quiet efficiency restored the room to order around him. He let himself be dressed and endured the small fuss over a nick on his knuckle left by the tapestry's rough edge. No one asked where the blue trace of dye had come from. It washed away under water that steamed faintly in the cold light. He left his chamber at his usual hour. Habit protects men like armor. Yet his eyes were not on the tapestry-laden halls this morning. They were on the seams, where the palace hid its labor, the joints of doors that led to service passages, the corners where brooms stood, the narrow stairs that climbed without glory. He carried his decision with the care of a breakable thing. He found her in a corridor near the chapel door, carrying a bundle of folded linens. She did not lift her gaze. Even when he stepped close enough that his scent, citrus and soap, touched the air between them, she looked only at the space between his shoes and the hem of her skirt. "Walk with me," he said softly. Her fingers tightened on the cloth. "Your Highness, I have—" "Walk with me," he said again, and the repetition held no threat, only insistence. She fell into step a half-pace behind, exactly as protocol demanded. He led them along a quiet passage where drafts made the lamps gutter, and no one with rank lingered. They stopped at a window set deep in the wall where the light fell gentle and grey. "Tell me," he said, "who breathes behind that cloth?" Her throat moved once. She swallowed the reflex of refusal. "My brother." He had thought so. Hearing it made the decision heavier and clearer at once. "How long?" "Since the last levy." Her voice barely rose above the sound of the draft. "He was taken. He ran. I found him outside the kitchens 3 nights later. He could not stand. You hid him in the palace. He let neither admiration nor censure color the words. He kept them level, the way one places a glass on a table without spilling it. In the only place I had where eyes do not always look," she said. "Behind a wall no one cares to touch." "What did he see?" the prince asked. "That made him run?" She stared at the linen in her arms, as if it could answer for her. Men can be made to do things they would never do, if hungry enough and frightened long enough. He was already not himself when they brought him to the square. When he came back to me, there was blood on his shirt and he would not speak. He had a fever that burned his name away for a day and a night. "And you brought him to the palace," he said again, and this time a breath of something like wonder entered the words despite him. The fabric pressed an imprint into her fingers. "I brought him where I knew every creak and shadow, where I could count footsteps, where I could pass without being seen, because that is my work." The window let a pale beam fall across her cheek. He studied the line it drew, finding in it the quiet stubbornness of someone who has endured long enough to be mistaken for calm. "You understand what will happen if the wrong person finds him," he said. "Yes. You understand what will happen to you." Her eyes lifted for the first time. They were not pleading. They were simple and defiant at once. "Yes." He took a breath that felt as if it had been held for years. "Then hear me. You will take less food. You will change nothing else. I will take notice of who takes notice." Her brow drew the smallest measure closer. "You will not call the guard." "I will not," he said. "Why?" There was no gratitude in the question, only prudence. "Because I do not yet know what justice looks like in this," he said. "And because last night I saw your hand on a blanket, and remembered that there is such a thing as mercy within these walls, even when we pretend otherwise." The corner of her mouth tensed as if stopping a sound. Not a sob. Something more dangerous. A laugh at the idea that mercy could belong to marble and gold. She bowed her head a fraction. The gesture had the texture of acceptance, not trust. A step sounded at the far end of the corridor. She shifted the linen higher instantly and took a pace backward that returned her to her role. A steward appeared, all tidy efficiency, and eyes that noticed if a candle burned too long. He bowed. The prince answered with the small nod reserved for those who ensured the palace continued to function and therefore held a power no one named. "Your Highness," the steward said, "the inventory of the pantry shows irregularities." "What sort?" the prince asked, bored. "Bread and meat, small amounts." Repeating, "We will tighten the count." "Do so," he said. "Waste is an irritant." The steward inclined his head again, but his gaze slid over the maid as one measures a seam. She had become a shape behind cloth. When he turned away, the prince let his breath leave slowly. "Be careful," he said to her, so quietly it might have been the draft speaking. She moved past him, each step correct, each gesture bland. Only the fine tremor at the edge of the linen told the truth. In the kitchen that afternoon, the carbon of the old hearth clung to the air and to hair and skin. She kept her head down and her hands busy. She cut and stirred and scrubbed and measured without error. Around her, voices remarked on nothing unusual. They traded the weather and the way a sleeve had torn and whether the new soap was as good as the old. Yet underneath, another current moved. "Who keeps cutting the cheese smaller?" a cook muttered without heat. "Leave me enough to plate without shame." "There are always crumbs on that flight of stairs now," a scullion said, eager. "Like a trail. Rats grow braver when winter holds, someone else replied. Mind your work. She breathed through her mouth to steady herself. The tray she had not carried last night sat scrubbed clean in the corner. She could still feel the wooden rim dig into her palm when she closed her hand to lift the pot in front of her. When she looked up accidentally, the steward's figure passed the door, not turning. She watched his shoes vanish. Her heart resumed only once he was gone. She finished her day without mistake. She did not linger where he might find her. She did not seek him. The promise he had given could not be leaned on. It had to be held lightly, like a thread that would snap if pulled. Dusk came early as it does when clouds mass. The palace rearranged itself into night's measured quiet again. She counted the minutes by tasks. Rake the coals, wash the last pot, wring cloths, lay knives to dry. When all had thinned to silence, she wrapped bread in paper, took the smallest piece of cheese she could justify, and hid both beneath a folded towel on a tray. She did not go directly. She took a longer route and paused at each turn to listen. Her steps knew the boards that did not complain. In the corridor near the forgotten wing, she stopped to gauge the air. It carried no breath but hers. He stepped out from shadow, as if the dark had decided to take a human shape. She swallowed the cry that rose reflexively to her throat. He lifted a finger, not to silence her. She was already quiet enough to disappear, but as a promise to keep what quiet they had. You should not be here, she said. I should be exactly where I am when I have chosen it, he answered softly. And I have chosen this place. She did not argue. She raised the tapestry. They entered together. The small chamber behind it had gathered an extra degree of warmth. Breath does that in tight spaces. The pallet lay as before, but one arm now lay outside the blankets. It was thin, too thin, and marked with a yellowing bruise along the wrist. The cup sat within easy reach, refilled from a stoppered flask she kept tucked behind a stone. Her movements were deft and light. She had done this enough to be quick without noise. The prince remained at the threshold. He let the closeness of the space dictate the measure of his presence. He did not step where she had to stand to reach her brother's side. He took the air that was left. The figure under the blanket stirred. The face that turned toward them was young, younger than hers by a handful of years. The eyes stayed half-closed a moment, then opened to a thin sliver that recognized light and shape and the relief of food. It is I, she said. Her voice shifted in this place. It lost its edges and softened, as if the walls required gentleness to stay standing. His gaze slid to the man at the doorway and held there, confused. The prince saw the instinct to fight cross that face and pass quickly into something else, a calculation too weak to sustain itself. You have water, the prince said, and realized as he said it that he had spoken to the wrong person. He spoke again to the man in the blankets. Drink a little. The brother reached. His fingers trembled but found the cup. He lifted it without spilling. That small victory reached the prince as a warmth more direct than any candle. Who is he? The brother whispered. A man who asks you to eat, his sister said. She placed a piece of bread in his hand, smaller than a coin purse. Slowly. He ate. It was not a hungry gulp. It was the cautious bite of someone who had learned that haste has a cost. He let the bite sit on his tongue, then swallowed as if teaching his throat a lesson it had once known. The prince watched and had to look away a moment, not because the scene was difficult, but because the care in it was not. He kept his voice low. How long can you keep him here without being seen? As long as I am careful, she said. Care is not armor, he replied. It is what I have. He could have told her of armor that has failed under pressure, of titles that do not protect the heart they encase. He said instead, the pantry is being counted. The steward notes crumbs. Eyes grow sharper when there is less to distract them. Her shoulders drew in a fraction. I know. You must change your pattern, he said. Not your path. She understood immediately. Less, and unevenly. Never the same night twice. He looked at the boy on the pallet and measured the body's need against risk. Enough to keep him standing. Not enough to draw a map in scraps. The brother's gaze moved between them as if following a game he did not know the rules to. He swallowed another bite. I did not want to come here, and the voice held apology without self-pity. She would not let me die elsewhere. Be grateful for her stubbornness. I am, the young man answered, and the words slid into the tight space and made it larger by an inch. A sound in the corridor outside turned them all to stillness. A footstep, or only the weight of the building settling. The prince lifted his hand and let it hover, as if he could press the air flat. The sound faded. Breath returned, cautiously, like a rabbit testing open ground. She cut the cheese with the smallest knife. She did not take the whole of what she had brought. She wrapped what remained back in paper and slid it under the empty towel on the tray. The brother watched with a child's focus. When his eyes closed again, it looked like sleep earned, not collapse. We have the night, she said in a whisper that could have been mistaken for prayer. We have this night, the prince corrected gently, and less of the next. If anyone asks questions, say nothing. If you must speak, speak simple and short. I will say enough for two. Her breath caught again at that. He had not expected the effect. He had spoken as a man who could afford to take blows. She heard him as a woman who could not afford to let him. Do not do anything foolish, she said. I have begun already, he said, without humor. She lowered her gaze. He wanted to ask her name then, an absurd impulse. Names become levers. He denied himself the right to one, just as he denied others the right to her secret. He watched instead the way she touched the edge of the blanket one last time before they left, like a seal set on a letter. They slipped out. The tapestry fell into place, heavy and quiet. In the corridor, the night resumed its stern face. When he walked back toward his own quarters, he saw a figure at the far end of the hall. The steward again, or another of his kind, taking the measure of a space. The man knelt and touched the floor with 2 fingers. He brought them to his nose, then set them on the wall. Dust coated them gray. He studied the smear with the devotion of a monk reading a marginal note. The prince passed him with a softness that did not arise from fear, but from strategy. The man stood and bowed, and made no comment. His eyes, though, held questions that multiplied too quickly. In the morning, whispers had found their way out of the kitchens and into the corners of the public rooms. Not as stories yet. As cautious observations that sought a listener capable of turning them into commands. A guard mentioned to another that a candle stub had been found burned down to nothing in a passage where no one had orders to pass. A woman who swept the grand stair remarked that the dust near a certain wing never settled. Tongues placed words like stones from which others might build. He endured a meeting where numbers and duties piled upon each other. His mother sat like a sentence no one could appeal. She watched him as one watches a horse for signs of weakness, waiting for a flaw to become a habit. He kept his back straight and his answers precise. When the meeting ended, she did not dismiss him at once. You are restless, she said, not unkindly. I am attentive, he replied. Do not play with the household, she said. A palace is not a garden for princes to rearrange when they escape boredom. The household runs as it should, he said. See that it continues to, she answered. He bowed. The exchange would have read as ordinary to anyone else. Only he felt its edges. She had scented movement she could not name. She would set others to find the shape of it. By afternoon he could not remain where he was most visible. He walked where men of his rank do not linger, under the pretense of noticing for the first time the places where the palace breathes. A chamberlain fell into step beside him. It was an old habit between power and its agents. Your Highness, the man said, voice pleasant, there are matters of order that would benefit from your eye. What sort? The prince asked. Small things that, taken together, produce a draft. the chamberlain said with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "In the older wing near your suite. Drafts are common in old places, and improprieties are less so," the chamberlain replied, just as pleasantly. They walked. They looked at nothing and everything. When they parted, the prince stood in a quiet hall and let his fingers rest lightly on the strip of tapestry fringe closest to him. It felt like a thread that could either hold or saw through skin. Night would come again. He would have to decide whether to move them. He did not know where. The idea was a wall with no door. He went to the kitchens to look without seeming to. He found the tray she favored clean and set aside. He found no sign of panic in her movements, only care. When he returned to his chambers, a knock in the precise rhythm of the household summoned his attention. He opened the door to the chamberlain, whose face had discarded gentleness in favor of duty's plain shape. "The Queen Mother has ordered an inspection of the unused wings near your quarters at first light tomorrow." The announcement hung in the air after the chamberlain left, and the room lost a degree of warmth that no fire could restore. The prince stood still in the center of his chamber until the candle's flame steadied. "First light tomorrow." The words turned into counting. Hours, not days. He went to the window and found the sky a flat dark that gave nothing away. He had told himself there would be time to think, to plan, to choose between bad paths and worse ones. Now time had been folded small and set before him like a test. He remembered the small chamber behind the tapestry, the breath of a person near sleep, the way her hand had settled on the blanket, as if it could teach the world gentleness. He remembered the steward's eyes measuring dust. He saw the net tightening even where the palace's face remained serene. He reached for his coat. He did not ring. He left his chamber and sent his steps into the quiet that knits together the palace at night. Guards passed him, saluted. He dismissed them with a nod he had honed to reveal nothing. He took the longer route to the forgotten wing, moving with purpose but without haste. Running brings questions. Questions bring company. The tapestry met him in the same place, pretending to be only decoration. He slipped behind it and into the narrow passage. The air was close, held between stone and time. At the small chamber he paused and listened. She was there. Her whisper did not startle. It matched the space. "They come at dawn." "I know," he said. The candle showed her face. Tired, set. She had pulled her brother's pallet tighter against the warmest part of the wall. The boy's eyes were open and filmed with fever, but his hand found hers on the blanket without looking. "We cannot move him far," she said. "He cannot stand long. He burns and shivers and burns again." "If you carry him now," the prince said, "the odds of meeting someone are greater than the odds of mercy finding you." Her lips pressed together. That was the calculus she had done already. She waited for him to offer something else. He had nothing but his own decision. "I will try to delay them," he said. "I will try to misdirect. If we fail, I will stand between you and what follows." "Do not place yourself there," she said, a quick edge under the whisper. "They will call it folly. They will say you have lost respect for order." He almost laughed quietly at the thought that her care for him would be the thing that undid them. "They say many things," he said. "Tonight, I will decide which words matter." Her breath caught and steadied. "He will cough," she said. "In the cold he will cough. I will try to keep it quiet. Give him water whenever he wakes," he said, practical to keep fear from deciding his tone. She held the cup near her brother's mouth. The boy drank in small, learned swallows. His gaze drifted past the prince and then returned, as if the figure in the doorway were a trick of light. "Do you trust him?" he whispered. "With my life," she said, and the words did not tremble and did not flatter. They sat for a small while in the kind of silence that makes a pact. He watched her touch the edge of the blanket, making it smooth, not because it would help, but because hands need work to keep from shaking. He felt the urge to put his hand over hers, and knew that any contact now would turn them both into something they could not use when morning came. He took in a breath that did not land where he wanted it to. He stepped back. "When the light changes, listen," he said. "If they begin 3 halls away, you may have a little grace. If they begin here, do not waste the first seconds on fear. Use them on thought." She drew a breath that carried steadiness and despair in equal measure. "Go," she said. "You will do more for us there than here." He left. The tapestry fell heavy and unremarkable behind him. He did not go back to his bed. Sleep would fold him wrong and spit him out weaker. He went to the small writing table in his chamber and folded a sheet of paper in half and in half again until it was a square he could hide inside his palm. He wrote no words. Words leave trails. He used it only to remind himself of the shape of quiet decisions. Defend, delay, divert. He pressed the paper flat and put it in his pocket, a useless charm that lent his hand purpose when he could not control the rest. The palace began to stir, while the windows were still grey. Servants rose with the discipline of those who cannot afford to miss a bell. The smell of damp stone gave way to the faintest breath of smoke as hearths were coaxed awake. The prince dressed without help. He opened his door to a corridor that pretended it had not heard the chamberlain's news. He did not wait to be summoned. He sought the steward where he worked best, in motion. He found him on the stairs near the pantry, his hand already on his ledgers like a man who trusts numbers more than people. "You will conduct the inspection yourself," the prince said quietly, falling into step beside him. "You will start in the oldest storehouses and count the locks as well as the shelves. Draft is your enemy. Say so loudly." The steward blinked once, surprised to be addressed so early by a man who rarely intruded on the domestic side of power. He bowed. "As your highness commands." "And you will tell the men to mind the mortar in the older wing," the prince added. "Tapestries cover cracks that widen when prodded. A careless hand can make a wall fall." The steward's head tilted, interest sharpened by potential failure. "I will warn them." They reached the landing where the chamberlain waited with brisk efficiency in a small cluster of men. The chamberlain bowed. "Your Highness," he said with satisfaction, "you honor us with your presence." "I prefer a palace without drafts," the prince said, as if the inspection were his idea and his whim. "Then you will be pleased," the chamberlain replied lightly. "We will leave no corner comforted by neglect." The prince saw the way he used the word corner and understood the shape of the man's suspicion. He smiled without showing teeth. "See that you do not wake old stones into anger." The party moved. They began, as he had directed, in a room whose door had not been opened for months, where the air held the ghost of stored apples and the floor caught every footfall with a small complaint. The steward counted locks. He measured the number of shelves and the number of empty jars. He called out fractions and names. Men began to feel the weight of procedure slide onto their shoulders, and their pace took on the rhythm of duty, not hunt. The prince kept them there as long as he could without being obvious. He pointed to a crack in plaster. He asked for linen on a window whose draft could be blamed for a headache. He redirected a man who reached by instinct for a rusted hook. Each minute one felt small and vital. But the palace had more than one will at work. As the steward closed his ledger on the second store and prepared to move to the third, the air changed. It was not sound. It was not light. It was the way presence enlarges a space without announcing itself. The Queen Mother came. She did not need many attendants to draw the eye. She wore mourning-like armor, simple and exact, and gave the impression that the sun had waited for her to appear before starting the day. She surveyed the cluster of men, the prince among them, with the cool assessment of someone who knows how to name outcomes. "Good morning," she said. "Majesty," the chamberlain murmured, bowing much lower than he had for the prince. She let her gaze rest on her son. "We will proceed." The prince did not argue in words. He sidestepped to walk beside her, setting a pace that looked like deference and functioned as drag. He pointed at a window that no longer opened. He drew her attention to a faded portrait, whose gilt shed flakes that could be mistaken for dust. She indulged him for 3 steps. Then she lifted her hand, and the men behind her spread out with a precision that undid his patient delay. "Tapestries," she said. A man reached for the first heavy hanging. He lifted it aside and found only blank wall. Another did the same 2 doors down. Dust released itself into the air and made throats scratch. The prince calculated distance. The tapestry, he feared, was 8 lengths away. He counted 5, raised and lowered again. He considered whether to invent a hazard. The chamberlain's pleasant face had lost its softness. His eyes were watching for the thing that would confirm a suspicion and cement his usefulness. "Careful with the older cloth," the prince said, too late to change the momentum. "The dye—" The warning finished itself in his mouth, without touching ears already committed to a different outcome. The 7th tapestry rose. Nothing. The 8th. A roughness caught on the man's hand. The tapestry came away from the wall in a way that meant a hand had worked that edge more often than dust would account for. The air behind it was warmer by a breath. "There," the chamberlain said, quiet and satisfied. The Queen Mother did not flinch. "Open it," she said. The man lifted the fabric. The narrow gap revealed itself like a mouth. The prince stepped forward, as one who should see danger first, and paused not to stage delay, but because sound came from inside at exactly the wrong moment. A cough, smothered too late. The man nearest the gap went in at once. Another followed. The passage swallowed them, and a heartbeat later fed them back with a pale face between them. The maid stumbled over the threshold with her hands raised not in surrender but in supplication. Her dress had collected dust along the hem. Her hair had loosed its tie. Behind her, a second pair of men bent to lift a body that was more bone than weight. "No," she said, and the word expanded in the small circle of air as if it could become a shield. "Please, no." The chamberlain's mouth did not move when he smiled. He had what he had come for. The Queen Mother's gaze remained level, as if the exact form of the failure in her household did not change the fact that it was failure. "Bring them out," she said. The corridor drew back to make room. Servants who had not dared to come near before drifted into the edges like moths. The prince stepped forward. The maid's eyes found him at once, and changed shape in a way that would look like nothing to anyone else. Not gratitude, not hope, not relief. Recognition, heavy as truth. The men carried the brother with the care one sometimes shows to things that can break. His head lolled. The air bit his throat. The attempt at breath became the cough that had betrayed him. The steward's eyes flicked to the flakes of crust near the pallet inside and then to the tray under the towel, and the ledger in his head tallied its proof. "Who sanctioned this?" the Queen Mother asked, speaking to the air and letting the question choose its target. "No one," the maid said, voice shaking and steady at once. "I did what no one would permit." The chamberlain's gaze slid toward the prince in a movement small enough to deny if challenged. The Queen Mother ignored it. She studied the maid the way surgeons study the place on a body where a knife must go if it is to end pain. The corridor waited without breath. "Take them," she said at last, "to the great hall." The hall received them with the cold dignity of stone that has echoed too often with voices that decide fates. Guards took their places with the boredom of habit. A handful of officials appeared as if conjured by the scent of scandal. The steward settled at the edge, ledger against his chest, suspicion turned into data, and therefore into comfort. The maid stood with her brother's weight sagging against her, until a guard, to his credit, eased the boy to a seat. She stayed beside him, one hand on his shoulder, as if reminding him of the shape of the world. The prince stood opposite the Queen Mother. The chamberlain placed himself at a respectful angle from power, close enough to be seen, far enough to avoid blame's first splash. "Explain this," the Queen Mother said, as one might say, "begin." The maid's mouth opened and closed. Speech fled to the back of her throat, and could not be coaxed forward by will alone. The prince drew in breath. "I will begin," he said, and the pronoun altered the room. "No," the chamberlain said smoothly. "Majesty, the inventories have shown a clear pattern of—" "Be silent," the Queen Mother said without turning her head. And the chamberlain obeyed as if a hand had closed his lips. The prince stepped into the space those words had opened. "This began with hunger," he said, "and with fear. A young man was taken under levy. He fled. His sister found him. She chose the only shelter she knew, which was the place where she could count shadows and footsteps." "You speak as if the palace were a kindness," the Queen Mother said, tone dry. "I speak as if human beings live inside it," he said. The officials shifted, uncomfortable. The steward looked down, numbers suddenly insufficient. The Queen Mother's eyes narrowed. "And you? What place do you inhabit in this story? The chamber which sheltered this crime lies near yours." He did not drop his gaze. "I discovered it 2 nights ago." "You discovered it," she repeated, every inch of calm intact, "and did not act." "I acted," he said. "I did not call soldiers, because what they are trained to do is not what mercy requires. I chose to watch, to understand, to prevent harm where I could. Today I tried to delay your search to give me time to find a better path. I failed at that. I will not fail at what comes next." "Which is?" she asked, as if the word itself were a blade offered hilt first. "To ask that we answer a question before we punish those who were crushed by it," he said. "What is the value of a body to a crown? Is it only the weight it can carry in war, or is it the life it holds in peacetime? He is a boy. She is a servant whose crime is love in the form of bread. I stand before you not to deny the breach, but to deny that only one kind of justice exists." Silence, then. A true silence, the kind that drops into places where what is said cannot be unsaid. The Queen Mother's nostrils flared once. It did not register as anger exactly. It read as the recognition of a line being drawn where she had not planned one. "You speak of mercy from a position that cannot be punished as others are punished," she said. "I speak of mercy because the position I hold has punished me in different ways," he answered. A ripple moved through the small assembly, a murmur that was quickly hushed and that nonetheless acknowledged a door opening on a private grief he would never name here. The chamberlain found his opportunity. "Majesty, if we are to preserve order, exceptions cannot be paraded as virtues. Order without pity is not order," the prince said, and the echo of the sentence surprised even him in that hall. The Queen Mother lifted her hand. The gesture condensed the room again into obedience. She looked at the brother with the cool gaze of a woman who has buried more than one soft thing so that harder things might live. She looked at the maid until that earnest, unlovely face blurred into the shape of all the women she had ever ordered, excluded for the sake of a principle. "When a thing breaks in a household," she said, "we do not burn the house to rid it of splinters." The prince's jaw clenched. "No," he said, "we gather the splinters carefully and ask why the wood split." She held his eyes. It lasted long enough for the chamberlain to shift and the steward to swallow and a guard to adjust his grip. Finally, she spoke with an evenness that cut and bound at once. "We will not make a spectacle of this. The boy will be held until counsel is taken. The girl will be dismissed from service and confined nearby until a decision is set. There will be no public sentence given here and now." The maid sagged a breath she had not committed to releasing. The brother's head lolled and lifted again, drawn toward the sound of a drink being set near his hand. The prince did not move. Relief at the absence of immediate cruelty did not satisfy what he had asked for. It did not matter. It was a door, not a wall. He bowed his head a fraction, acknowledging not victory, but the possibility of one. "Thank you," he said, and let the words land where they would. The Queen Mother regarded him with a complexity that might have been sorrow from a kinder life. "You will present your arguments to those who advise as soon as we are assembled," she said. "Until then, Ensure that no further improvisations take place under your roof. I will answer for all that has happened under it, he said quietly. See that you do, she replied. Guards moved without cruelty. They did not drag the boy. They supported him. One stood near the maid and did not put a hand on her. She put her palm against her brother's shoulder, a touch as light as breath, and looked once at the prince. It was not a plea. It was a recognition of a line that had been crossed in the open, and of the cost to him of stepping over it. He inclined his head. It was a promise, not a courtesy. The hall emptied in degrees. The chamberlain left with the air of a man who has gathered exactly as much rope as he can use later. The steward closed his ledger over dust that had become evidence and now needed to be rewritten in a kinder ink. The Queen Mother passed last, her attendants a small current behind her. The prince remained a moment in the space that had held judgment. He felt the stone under his feet, the cold weight of the building, the subtle shift of all the eyes that had seen him set himself in the path of a blow. He breathed once, deep enough to find steadiness again. Then he turned and walked toward the corridor that would lead him to whatever arguing a son could do within a kingdom that had its own unyielding voice. He found the council gathered in a smaller chamber off the great hall, a room the palace used when the talk would bruise rather than break. The windows were high and mean with light. A long table held more ink than bread. The Queen Mother sat at the head, hands folded, the picture of order. The chamberlain stood at her right, a shade behind, his face arranged into usefulness. The steward waited with his ledger shut, as if numbers might be courted by silence. The prince did not ask to speak. He took the seat opposite his mother and let his posture hold what his words would risk. He felt the pulse in his throat and refused to let it accelerate his tone. This is not a matter for spectacle, the Queen Mother said without preamble. It will be handled with discretion. If you have arguments, present them quickly and plainly. He nodded once. The boy is young and ill. The girl has committed a crime of shelter, not advantage. If we make a show of breaking them, we teach the household to hide its pity better, not to be virtuous. The chamberlain's smile thinned. Majesty, we cannot educate a palace with exceptions. The levy depends upon the crown's capacity to command without being hated, the prince said, turning to him and then back to his mother. A boy hanged for running will not increase our strength. He will feed resentment. A boy spared under terms will caution others without teaching them despair is the only answer. The Queen Mother inclined her head a fraction. Terms. Service, he said. Supervised. Away from the capital, where tongues are sharpest. Hard labor, yes, because consequences must be visible, but within a structure that keeps him breathing. A royal estate in the countryside. He will not be free to walk where he pleases, but he will not be destroyed in the name of warning others. What of the girl? The chamberlain asked. She used the palace as a shield. She is dismissed from service, the prince said, steady. She loses her place and her wage, which is punishment enough for a woman with no dowry and no protector, no lash, no cell. She leaves at dawn with her brother and goes where the crown assigns him. Let her labor near him, under the same watch, so that the burden she took upon herself becomes work instead of shame. The steward cleared his throat. Your Highness, there are expenses to account for. 2 mouths where we intended to feed one. The prince's mouth almost hardened into disdain, but he held the line of courtesy. Take them from my household stipend for the year. Have your numbers. I will have the outcome. A pause opened. The Queen Mother's gaze did not leave his face. You will attach your name to this? Yes. And if it is questioned? I will answer with mine. Silence pressed like a palm on the table. It was not the silence of agreement. It was the silence that considers weight. The chamberlain spoke softly, a last attempt to bend the line. Majesty, compassion has a way of multiplying itself into trouble. If the boy runs again, your leniency makes a liar of the crown. Then make the prince the guarantor. the steward said unexpectedly, words slipping out before he had time to dress them. He flushed, but did not retract them. If the boy runs again, it will be the prince's shame to answer. The Queen Mother looked from one man to the other, then back to her son. You accept this. He did not glance away. I do. What do you think you are saving? She asked, quiet enough that the question reached only the length of the table. Not a legacy, he said. Not a name. A life. 2. And your soul, she said, more softly still, a remark with a needle in it. If such a thing can be served by acts, he answered, not flinching. She laid her fingertips on the table and lifted them again, as if measuring the texture of wood. So be it, she said. The boy is assigned to supervised labor on a royal estate. Records will reflect that he serves the crown there until he earns trust. The girl is dismissed from the household but not otherwise punished. She may accompany him as a worker, subject to the same supervision. The prince's name sponsors this arrangement. The chamberlain accepted the decision with a bow that hid irritation in the angle. The steward opened his ledger without sighing and made a note, numbers reassembling themselves around a compromise. The prince inclined his head. He had won less than he wanted, and more than he feared he would lose. He did not gloat. Gloating would cheapen what had been preserved. Send word at once, the Queen Mother said. They leave at dawn. I will not have them paraded through the day like a lesson. We will do this in the hour when the city does not look. He stood. She stood. For a moment, they were mother and son, without the table between them, without the armor of rank. Something passed over her features that resembled fatigue, or memory, or both. Do not mistake this for indulgence, she said. I do not, he said. I call it courage. She did not answer. She turned away first, which in this room meant he had been granted something no ink could record. He left before the chamberlain could find an excuse to walk at his shoulder. In the corridor, the air felt thinner, easier to breathe. He did not go to his rooms. He went where warmth remained when the rest of the palace cooled. The kitchen doors opened to the old breath of the hearth. The great oven's heat had been let down for the night, but coals still held a dusky glow. A guard stood near the entrance and made room for him without comment. The gesture said everything. The command had already been passed. The line between penalty and mercy had already been drawn. She was there. Not confined in a cage or pressed into a corner, but seated on a low stool near the banked fire, hands folded over an empty apron that bore the faint marks of years of work. Her hair was tidy again. Someone had handed her a cup of broth. It sat untasted on the table beside her. The guard kept his eyes on the far wall. The kitchen itself had arranged its silence like a shield so that nothing would be overheard unless it was meant to be. He stepped into that soft ring of space. The light found the planes of his face and softened them. She rose because her body had learned to do that whenever he drew near, and then stopped herself, because something in his expression said this was not a moment for hierarchy. It is decided, he said. She did not breathe for a heartbeat. Say it plain. He did. He serves on a royal estate under watch. No noose, no cell. You are dismissed from the household. You may go with him and labor there, under the same eyes, under my name. You are not beaten. You are not branded. Her hand flew to her mouth as if to keep a sound from escaping that would belong to a different kind of room. Tears did not fall. She did not have that luxury in front of a guard, or a prince, or a memory that would be retold by others. But something in her shoulders loosened that had been clenched for nights without count. You took the cost, she said. Yes. And your mother agreed. She measured the wood, he said, the hint of a smile that did not reach pleasure. She decided not to burn the whole house. A breath left her, shaky and honest. She looked at the stool and then at him. He gestured. She sat. He did not take a chair. He remained standing, as if the role would restrain the rest of him from saying what he should not say. Thank you, she said frankly, no flourish in it. Not for me alone. Yes, for you also, he replied. We do not need to pretend otherwise. The guard shifted his weight once, a soft scrape on stone, and then was still again. The world beyond the kitchen shortened to a corridor no one would walk this hour. The coals gave off a smell like old bread and iron. He reached for a small wooden tray set near the hearth. It was clean. It had been scrubbed by careful hands, corners dried with cloth so that no damp would warp it. For a moment, the absurdity of a prince holding a servant's tray struck him. A small, radical comfort. He set it on the table before her. She stared at it. A memory rose between them fully formed, the weight of a tray between door and threshold, the silence that was not consent and not refusal. I brought this to you, he said, and the words were more than literal. She blinked once. As equals. Yes. He sat at last, across from her. He unwrapped a cloth bundle he had carried, bread still warm from the last bake, saved somewhere on the way without asking permission. He broke it in half, and then, because habits are hard to shed, he waited for her to take her share first. She did, fingers steady now. She held it a moment, as if the heat might steady what the day had shaken. He poured the broth from her cup into 2 smaller bowls and slid one to his side. They ate in silence for a few breaths, not because there was nothing to say, but because the act said enough. The taste of simple food is different when the mouth is not braced for judgment. When he sleeps, he looks like a boy, she said, soft, eyes on the low fire. In the day, the bones show. At night they hide. It is a mercy of light. I saw the boy, he said. I could not unsee him. She looked up. The expression on her face was complicated and devastatingly plain. Gratitude, restraint. The stubborn, careful pride that had kept her upright while she carried fear without dropping any of her other duties. Do you believe in fate? She asked. In choices, he said. And in the places they lead when we are not prepared. She nodded once, not convinced, not dismissing. The guard cleared his throat gently, a reminder that the hour would not stretch forever. Dawn waited behind a wall. I will walk you to the gate, the prince said. You need not. I will, he repeated, and the repetition carried a weight she could park her own insistence against. She stood. The tray lay empty between them. He lifted it and held it a moment longer than necessary, tempted to name it what it had become. He set it back down carefully, as if relinquishing an emblem to the person who had given it meaning. They walked together down the corridor. The guard followed at a respectful distance that pretended not to be an escort. Air grew cooler in the service passage and then took on the flavor of outside, the scent of damp stone, the iron tang that develops when a city is still asleep. In the small alcove beside the door, her brother waited, wrapped in a blanket, eyes clearer than they had been in the hall. A second guard leaned against the wall, alert without malice. The young man stood when he saw them. He swayed and steadied. He looked at the prince with a searching expression, as if trying to find a name that fit. Sir, he said, because he had no other word that would not taste false on his tongue. The prince inclined his head. You will work, he said. You will live. I will work, the boy said, and when he looked at his sister, resolve replaced some of the bruised humility. We will. She adjusted the blanket at his shoulder. The movement was so intimate and so ordinary that it hurt more than any speech. She glanced at the dawn gray beyond the gate, and then at the prince again. I have nothing to give you, she said, and meant the kind of token other stories would provide at such a juncture. You gave me a measure of myself I did not know I had, he said. Take the rest back with you. The look they shared then did not demand a future. It acknowledged a present earned by choices. The romance was not in promise. It was in recognition. He had risked his standing for a servant. She had risked her life for a brother. Their courage had recognized itself. He lifted a hand. He did not touch her. His fingers hovered a breath above her sleeve and withdrew. A gesture of restraint that contained all that could not be spoken, and all that had been. "Go with the first light," he said. "It is kinder." She nodded. She did not curtsy. That, too, was a change the palace would not record. The guard swung the small gate open. Cold air slipped in like a fact. She placed her hand at her brother's elbow and stepped forward. They crossed the threshold together. He remained in the alcove and watched them pass into the pale hour when the city holds its breath. The lane beyond was empty of citizens and full of small sounds. Cartwheels in the distance, a dog shaking itself awake, the whisper of someone sweeping a step. The two figures moved toward the waiting cart that would take them to the larger road, their shapes startlingly ordinary and therefore precious. He did not follow. He turned and walked back through a palace that felt altered by an inch. Servants would talk in careful phrases today. The steward would adjust his figures. The chamberlain would polish his grievances into potential. His mother would consider where to place him so that his audacity could be channeled toward utility. All that would unfold in the daylight. For now, he climbed the last flight of stairs to his own corridor. The scent of beeswax lingered where the lamps had been trimmed. The silence held no threat. Outside his door, at the place where wood meets stone, a tray waited. Empty. He stopped, and something warm rose through the ache the night had left in his bones. He bent, lifted it with both hands, and understood that emptiness can be full when it is chosen. He carried the tray inside, set it on his table, and left the door open to the morning, which arrived like a promise kept. Thank you so much for listening to this story all the way to the end. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us while telling it. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave us a comment telling us where you're listening from and what you like the most. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like as a show of support. That really motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotion and life lessons. And before we go, we want to remind you that an exciting and heartwarming story recommendation will appear on the final screen. If you'd like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you once again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.